Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to be here today. Thanks to the Nixon Foundation for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm joined to my immediate right by Ambassador Kelley Currie. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's the founding partner of Kilo Alpha Strategies and was U.S. Ambassador at Large, for global women's issues. And to Kelley's right, we are joined by Christopher Nixon Cox. He is the CEO of Lightswitch Capital. Before that, he was a lawyer focused on private equity clients and issues. Actually, both Kelley and Chris are lawyers, and I ask you not to hold that against them too quickly. So our subject today is alliances, and I was sent in preparation for this panel a line from President Nixon that I think sums up his sort of nuanced position well. He said in 1969 in an address to the United Nations, "The history of the post-war period teaches that nationalism can be dangerously disruptive or powerfully creative. Our aim is to encourage the creative forms of nationalism, to join as partners where our partnership is appropriate and where it is wanted, but not to let a U.S. presence substitute for independent national effort or infringe on national dignity and national pride. It is not my belief that the way to peace is by giving up our friends or letting down our allies. On the contrary, our aim is to place America's international commitments on a sustainable, long-term basis to encourage local and regional initiatives to foster national independence and self-sufficiency, and by so doing, to strengthen the total fabric of peace." A laudable goal and a very, Chris, I hope in a minute we can actually unpack that a bit. I think actually a very nuanced and careful position between extremes. But Kelley, Ambassador Currie, I'm going to start with you. Alliances are a fraught topic. And we are going to go left or we're going to go right here in a couple of months. We're going to have President Harris or we're going to have the return of President Trump. How do you rate the future of America's system of alliances, for good or for ill, in the two scenarios?
Well, first, thanks to the Nixon Foundation for having me on this panel. This is such a big topic, and I feel like it's a really fraught one in this moment, as you point out. And I also was reflecting on the quote from former President Nixon and thinking, you know, the very nuanced, as you said, articulation there about the role that America plays in terms of how we engage in the world, how we engage with our friends, what that means for our adversaries, and what, you know, why we're doing this. And I think that quote encapsulates so much about that has been lost in terms of the conversation around our alliances today. The discourse on one side seems to view our allies as burdens to be borne by us, and on the other side as folks that we should be leading from behind. And so I don't think that either one of those is a particularly valuable way of thinking about our allies. But I think that we are, and I think that neither way of framing, and I'm oversimplifying both positions kind of at the extremes, but I think that neither one of those approaches meets the geopolitical moment that we are in right now, where we find ourselves waking up from a vacation from history, and as it were, that I think took place in the post-Cold War era after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where we did not face a peer or near-peer competitor geopolitically, and we thought geopolitics was done, that's in the rear view, we're not doing that anymore, we'll walk off into some multilateral future together. The European Union is going to get rid of the idea of the nation state, and we're all going to kind of evolve in that direction where our borders are going to become less meaningful, where our nationalism is going to be considered dépassé, as it were, and not necessarily a potential force for good or a positive attribute. And that we're just going to, continue in this globalism vision in perpetuity. 9/11 was a bit of a wake-up call from that in terms of the dangers of globalism, but also an important reminder of the value of our allies, because our allies came to our defense and stood with us and went to war and lost blood and treasure with us after that attack. And then we kind of then let our allies down after that by the decision to go to war in Iraq, and I don't want to litigate that, but I think that we really tested them. At the same time, we also were not asking, I think that some people in the Bush administration certainly were asking of our allies that they needed to do more and they needed to have a more realistic posture in terms of their own self-defense and regional defenses. And were disappointed in the failure that they saw of some of our allies to meet those challenges. And I'm speaking, of course, of Donald Rumsfeld's old Europe, new Europe discourse, and some of the other frustrations, for instance, with our South Korean allies about the failure to invest in deterrence and defense. And so this is not a new argument in some respects about, what do we expect from our allies. I think that there is a justifiable resentment toward especially some of our wealthier European allies who operate under an American security umbrella and don't invest properly in their own defense, and I'm looking at you, Germany. But I think that this is a real problem, that this administration has not successfully, for all of their talk coming into this administration about America's back and we want to work with our allies and all of this stuff and the challenges of the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, they have made almost no progress in getting Germany to invest in defense. And it's a huge problem. And Germany continues to be a big stumbling block as to why these alliances are under strain. And so I think that that's not going to change unless and until there's a change in Germany in terms of how they think about these issues, and and there's a stronger demand signal from the rest of Europe and from other places for Germany to reevaluate their own defense posture. All of that said, I think that we are also now, as we are waking up from this vacation from history and this, that we're trying to reorient our institutions and our policies. We're, embracing economic security in ways that we haven't done since deep in the Cold War. And this is going to continue to put strain on our alliances as well, because they've depended on, again, looking at you, Germany, looking at the United States as the market of last resort to send products over to maintain German industrial capacity. That's not going to be sustainable going forward. So I think that regardless, and I know this is a really Weasley answer, but I think regardless of who wins in November, these alliances are going to continue to face structural challenges because they are not right now fit for purpose in the geopolitical moment we face, where we have not just China as a peer or near-peer competitor and the pacing threat, but a China that is very comfortable now with sowing chaos and working with other chaos. I always refer to the Russians and the United Nations as chaos monkeys because they're very happy to just go in there and just start pulling the wires out and make a mess and not feel like there's any responsibility about it. The Chinese never were really like that, but more recently they've started to see a strategic advantage in letting the Russians pull the wires out of the machine and make a mess if it puts the United States on the back foot. And same with the Iranians. Yeah, sure, let them go in there and start, making a mess. And the Americans are stuck with the, cleaning it up. And we can just sit here and say nonsense things about Gaza and align ourselves with the global South with absolutely no responsibility. So they've realized that this is a strategic advantage for them, and they are taking full advantage of it. And we are on the back foot with it. And so we've got to reshape how we think about our alliances. We've, in some cases, got to demand more of them. And that's true, again, regardless of who's going to be in charge after January.
This panel is a safe space for both condemnations of the CCP and of Germany, so feel free to keep
know.
both going.
Hey, I was worried before.
No, you're among friends. So, Chris, I mean, first of all, feel free to comment on any of that you would like to in my original question. But my specific first question for you is, I mean, you had 15 years with President Nixon. You've obviously retained admiration and some fascination since then. That quote that I read illustrates something that I think is widely known about the man, but not necessarily like understood in its details, which is, you know, if we imagine the two extremes of the discussion on alliances, on the one hand, there's sort of these religious things that are up in heaven to be venerated and never questioned. And on the other hand, they're just sucks on our national energy and just like do nothing for us. It's us always doing things for them. He clearly, on the evidence not only of that quote, but really his whole career and certainly his presidency, is somewhere very carefully in the middle of those two things and sort of conscious of and balancing both things. Help us understand a bit the Nixon view of alliances.
Well, thanks. That's a great question for me because it's about my grandfather, so I can go on with what I want to. And I apologize to the audience. It was supposed to be General Kellogg sitting in this seat, and you got me, so sorry about that. But at least we got a good presentation from General Kellogg at lunch. But thank you for the question, my grandfather. I was thinking about it a little bit. My grandfather had a healthy respect for alliances. Of course, he appreciated the U.S. allies and understood how important our relationship and historic relationship with the U.K. was. And of course, the importance of Japan, giving back Okinawa to Japan was a big part of how he thought he could expand the alliance with Japan. But I think my grandfather had this suppleness of mind where he was looking at what's in the best interest of the United States. And I think he realized that alliances could be like a ship. When you christen a ship, it's big and strong and can go throughout the sea and operate well. And then the ship gradually develops barnacles, the wood rots, it slows down, it gets pushed off course, and the alliances need to be refreshed. So what worked 25 years ago doesn't necessarily work today. And my grandfather had the suppleness of mind to realize that. And he also realized that alliances that were opposing the United States weren't necessarily as strong as they seemed. And that, of course, the great example of that was between China and Russia, where automatically people would assume, well, they're both communist countries, both say horrible things about the United States. In reality, my grandfather realized that they were, in the 1960s and 70s, at the point of war, in a state of war. And he was able to take advantage of that. So I think that what my grandfather put forward first was, what's in the best interest of the United States? How can we use alliances to our advantage? And how can we break apart the alliances of those opposed to us? So, it's great to have this healthy worship of alliances, as you said. That's good that we like our allies that much. But we have to keep refreshing them and make sure that they continue to work for us. And, when you look at China, the United States and China worked best, whether we had an alliance, we certainly ended the Cold War together. We worked best when we had a mutual interest. And when China and the United States had the mutual interest of defeating communist Russia, we could be great friends. Well, now I think with President Trump, there's been a re-examination of is that alliance working well for both of us? And of course, as we've heard today, my grandfather, questioned. What should the United States relationship with China be going forward? He questioned that in the 1990s and said it just shouldn't automatically be one where we're just friends and sort of ignore our differences. We have to work on our differences. So I think he would look at alliances as something that's constantly evolving and something that we need to keep working on and where we can take advantage of opponents' weaknesses. And of course, I have the benefit of having grown up with my grandfather. It was the first 15 years of my life, so I wasn't talking with my grandfather when I was the age of 5 about the alliance between the United Kingdom
Very disappointing.
And the United States. But at the end of my life, I remember I was sat down with my grandfather. It was 1994. And I see we have Newt Gingrich. I know he's in the house here somewhere over here, I think. But I know Newt Gingrich is here, and it was 1994. My grandfather died 6 months before the 1994 election. I was 15 years old. I thought I was a great political strategist. So I walked into my grandfather's office, and I said, I called him Ba. That was what we called him. I said, Ba, I want to talk to you about politics. And I said, I have a great sense that the Republicans are going to do so well in the election. He's like, well, come sit, tell me about it. So I started talking to him, and I said, I think we're going to win this Senate seat. I think it was Alabama. Richard Shelby, I think, won that year. So we're going to win Alabama. We're going to win a few of these other Senate seats. And I said, I think we even have a shot at Hawaii. And he gave me this look like, not a chance. But I did get to talk to him a little bit about, about this topic of alliances. And I remember one thing that he taught me about trade in particular. So I delved into politics for a second, but the one thing I remember him talking about with trade is that he said the United States needed to trade with our allies and give good trade deals to our allies during the Cold War, because that was the way we could build them up and create economic powers that would confront the Soviet Union, offer our allies, and this is something he actually wrote down, offer our allies more than our enemies. And that's something we always have to remember. And I think we kind of lost track of that in the 2000s. And as we start thinking about trade again, we have to start thinking about this rise of nationalism again, and who's on our side, who's against us. And, it's okay to make a deal that's beneficial for the other side if they're our friends. But we certainly shouldn't be giving our enemies more than we give our friends. So I remember he said that to me. And then I remember when he passed away, I found in his desk a little card where he had 10 commandments for presidents. And one of the commandments was always do more for our friends than we do for our enemies, and to keep that in mind. That was one of his commandments. So I think it was like 5 or 6. So those are a couple of things that maybe I learned from him. It's probably not a complete picture, but through the eyes of a 15-year-old child, that's what I remember about my grandfather.
That's amazing. Thank you. Kelley, I want to continue on the theme of your first answer, but zoom into Europe and to NATO. The actual title of our panel is Strengthening America's Alliances. When we talk about strengthening the NATO alliance, again, sticking with my practice here of kind of picking 2 straw men and asking you to navigate between them, there's one approach that says we should basically continue what we're doing. We'll continue to guarantee the security of our allies in Europe against Russia. We'll complain about their lack of defense spending, but we're not really going to actually do that much about it in practice. The argument would run there'd be more liabilities in doing more about it than in just continuing to complain. So that's one approach. Another approach is actually you're going to strengthen the alliance through a kind of shock therapy by putting these guys on notice that, look, we care about the security of Europe, of course. America's security has been tied for some time to the security of Europe. We're not leaving. But you people need to understand that we have major problems elsewhere in the world. We have a major problem with China and the Western Pacific, and you need to stand up for yourself. You need to quote Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance, you need to stand on your own 2 feet when it comes to our NATO allies. Talk to us about those 2 broad options. What is it going to take to strengthen NATO?
Well, I think actually it is a little bit of a straw man, but actually not that much, because I don't think the current situation is sustainable. I agree with, as much as I believe the United States should be robustly supporting the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians, and in fact, I would argue for taking off the handcuffs and letting them win this war, make that the actual objective instead of just giving them enough weapons and capabilities to just stay in the fight. Give them the capabilities to win and really acknowledge that that's the objective instead of trying to manage escalation, which I see as the current policy. I think that's a huge mistake. And I think that our allies especially the allies who have committed more to the defense of Ukraine, who have committed more to building their own capabilities, the allies who have joined the alliance in the past 3 years, in Sweden and Finland, you see that there is still a robust demand for allies who are willing to pull their weight and who are willing to do their share, and they should be rewarded for doing that. They should not be punished for the bad behavior of their other countries that are not willing to do the needful things. Where this becomes a problem, especially with Europe, is the kind of lack of the incomplete and imperfect overlap between the European Union on the one hand and the project of Europe whole and free that is represented by the European Union versus the project of Europe whole and free that is represented by NATO. And the misalignment between those two fundamental institutions in Europe, and how the misalignments within those two institutions play out with things like who decides what Europe's foreign policy is, who decides what, and the space that it creates for people like President Macron to come in and say, we need a European defense force that is linked to the European Union. And my response to that actually would be like, oh, sure, go for that. Let's see how that works out for you. Except that I do worry about the consequences of withdrawal and of us not being there to support the countries that have done the needful things and are, I think we do need to, as Chris said, we need to find ways to incentivize and reward our friends who are doing the right things and send sharper messages to the ones who are not, that there are consequences and that we cannot continue to do this. It's just not sustainable as we face the kinds of challenges that we face in the Pacific. And so I think that we need to be more transparent and clear with the countries that are the lagging indicators, whether it's the France and Germany, Hungary, and some of the countries that have decided to support Russia, support China, and bandwagon with China on different things, that we need to be clear about what our expectations are as alliance members within NATO. I think this is true also with Turkey. I think we have a huge problem with Turkey as an alliance member, that they are not always operating in ways that are to the benefit of the alliance. But I think, again, going back to this trend that I see where we are more focused than, or where we're like trying to realign our economic, this concept of economic security, where, for the longest, during our vacation from history, we worked really hard over the past 30 years to separate out economic policy making from national security policy making. This was not so much the case during the Cold War. We did not trade with Russia. We just didn't do it. It wasn't even like a thing that we said we were going to do. Germany did, but we did not. And there were consequences for Germany as a result of them doing more business with Russia than we thought was prudent. And it was an ongoing tension in our relationship during the Cold War as well. So this is not a new problem, as I said. But now we are dealing with it in a different dynamic where it's, with Beijing, where we are much more economically integrated. We do face different challenges, and we need the alliance to think, to be more self-sustaining and not be so reliant on the United States. Because we do face a different kind of challenge, and the interests are not as perfectly aligned as they were, as well aligned as they were during Cold War 1.0. So I think that figuring out how we update NATO in ways that do strengthen it will include finding ways to do more and do more minilateral things. And we're doing this already. You see us doing this, whether it's with AUKUS or the Quad or other things where we just started pulling together part coalitions of the willing and using those to drag the others, the less willing, along. And I think that that's going to be the continued strategy that you will see if when you're thinking about how we accomplish the strategic goals that we're trying to accomplish.
So Kelley, I'll ask you this as a follow-up, but Chris, I'm also interested in your take here. Sticking with NATO, what is the Asian responsibility, the Pacific responsibility, if any, for this alliance? And we can speak in military terms, we can also talk in terms of economic relationships and trade as the years go on and this problem iterates, potentially in the direction of an actual hot war. I mean, you see indicators that cut in both directions. The Brits obviously are involved in AUKUS, which is very much an Asia, China-focused strategic initiative. And you've seen European nations here and there sail naval assets, through the Taiwan Strait recently, or conduct freedom of navigation operations in the Pacific one way or the other. So that's sort of in one column. In another column, there are European voices that are very much, and European nations that are very much on the other side of this question. I'll just highlight one, which is just a few weeks ago, I think he's the chair, Wolfgang Ischinger of the Munich Security conference, and no offense, kind of, if he has any friends here, but he wrote a piece in the New York Times where he essentially said, "America, we need to talk. I have some grievances. One, you're backing Israel too much. Makes it hard to talk about human rights when you're so in deep with the Israelis," which was kind of offensive. And then two, you've
especially coming from the Germans. But,
indeed.
Okay.
Two, he basically said, you're racing off into this hostile attitude towards China, and where was the I'm putting this in my own words, but this is fair. Where were the consultations? Where's the coordination with your European allies? Which again, I kind of take offense to. So there's two. This could cut either way. It may cut differently, probably according to country. What is the European role as things develop with China?
Well, there's my dream of what the European role would be, and then there's the reality. Right now, unfortunately, the European role is mostly unhelpful because of Germany, because of their insistence on doubling down on their dependence, their economic dependence on China. That is being driven largely by 4 or 5 major German companies that are basically directing the Chancellery to engage in policy approaches, both German and European Union, that undermine the economic prospects of the entire union in ways that are just unfathomable to me if you watch what Germany has been doing for the past 2 weeks to carry Beijing's water in undermining European Union efforts to put tariffs on electric vehicles to protect the European automobile market from Chinese EVs. And Germany has done, which again, what they're thinking here, I mean, it is just so short term that it is mind-boggling to watch them do this. And the idea, first of all, that we have not consulted with Germany on our concerns about their reliance on their over economic reliance on China and their failure to decouple themselves from Russia and to make their insistence on becoming energy dependent on Russia over the past 20 years is just ludicrous. Maybe Walter was not in those conversations, but that doesn't mean they did not happen. And so I think that it's extremely problematic. And I feel bad. Actually, no, I don't. I don't feel bad picking on Germany because they're such a big part of the problem. But they did, yes, they've done a FUNOP, a freedom of navigation operation and sailed in the Taiwan Strait. I think that there actually are a number of people in the German defense and security establishment who understand this and who are deeply frustrated with their political leadership and especially with the economic policy making and the decisions coming out of the Chancellery on these things. And so there is actually a lot more play. But what we need to be doing is strengthening those voices within the German establishment and marginalizing and expressing our unhappiness with the others because they are really making our job harder. And if I could put in a nutshell what I would like to see the Europeans do, what I think is a realistic expectation, is that they don't make our job harder in the Pacific. I'm not asking them to be major contributors to what we need to do in the Pacific. We have Pacific allies for that who are more than capable and who are ready to do the needful things because they understand the exigency of it. Our European allies, again, don't make this harder. Stand on your own feet. Give us more operational bandwidth and space to focus on the Pacific. And by making sure that you are producing munitions at scale, that you are taking care of your own defense budgets, and putting the necessary resources into those things. These are pretty minimal requests. We're not asking them to go to war with China if China takes Taiwan. What we are asking them to do, I think as a minimum, bare minimum, is that they join us in sanctioning China over their role in providing weapons to Russia to attack Ukraine, that they join us in doing things that, again, that are reasonable for their own security. And I don't think that's too much to ask of these countries. And I really get frustrated that we're, by these kinds of comments coming out. I mean, this like sends me when this stuff comes from the Germans, especially, that the nerve to really say that when given everything. And so I have I get a pretty strong reaction, but I think that pushing back on that, the French are actually weirdly among the most helpful here because they have territories in the Pacific. They are a Pacific power still. And so we can actually count on the French to be better on this and to work with us, especially on maritime domain awareness in the Pacific and helping to identify threats and push back on predatory Chinese behaviors in these Pacific Island countries, these poor, underdeveloped countries that are really struggling and are at the coalface of China's influence operations in the Pacific. We do get a fair amount, but again, it's not always. Sometimes it's kind of it's done in a very French way, which is not always the most helpful or friendly, but it gets done. And I think we have to meet these countries where they are in some cases. But we're seeing extraordinary things coming out of the Czechs, for instance, in terms of their willingness to engage with Taiwan and out of the Baltic states, and their understanding of the relationship between the fate of Ukraine and the fate of Taiwan. And so there are so many people in Europe who get it. They're just not yet necessarily in critical mass positions in some of the larger and more powerful states on the European continent. So it's just about trying to get them there and help them and support them in ways that are meaningful to them.
Chris, in a minute, I'm going to come to you with the Middle East and get to Israel directly. But before that, any thoughts on Europe and Asia?
Yeah, I think Kelley made some really excellent points. I would just add that it's really going to take leadership, and the U.S. has to lead. And we've, to some degree, not with President Trump, but fallen asleep a little bit after the end of the Cold War and sort of thinking history was over and democracy was inevitable. But democracy is only as good as the next generation, and we in the United States need to lead. What does that mean? We need to make ourselves strong domestically. We need to increase. We need to be smart about our defense industry, and we need to be the arsenal of democracy again. The strongest way to strengthen the European relationship is to demonstrate, especially in Ukraine, that we can supply overwhelming mass to the Ukrainians. This idea that the Russians can't be defeated and that Russia has all this mass and they don't lose wars, it's a fallacy. The Russia was able to win in World War II because the United States was able to supply Russia with unlimited mass. That's a major reason Russia was able to win. We need to be in that position again where we can supply our allies around the world unlimited mass in terms of artillery and bullets and tanks and things like this. And the best way to demonstrate that is with Ukraine, that we can do that and we can win in Ukraine. And our adversaries, whether it's Iran or whether it's China or or North Korea, they're going to be watching us. And if we can prove that we can do this and be successful, that will go much farther to creating a peaceful world than anything else we can do in terms of encouraging Europeans to produce more or not. Let's lead as Americans. So that would be one, what I'd say. And then two, I think we're going through so many internal divisions within the United States now. It's projecting weakness to the world. And we really need to figure out how we can come together as Americans and have a foreign policy where politics does stop at the water's edge, where we're going to do what's in the best interest of the United States. And that's going to be good for the world because ultimately the United States believes in freedom. It believes in, capitalist economic system that's going to lift, all boats around the world. Just ask the Chinese. It wasn't Chinese Marxism that brought 300 million, now 500 million Chinese out of poverty. It was, the interaction with the U.S. and trade with the U.S. and capitalism of the U.S. that did that. So, we need to strengthen ourselves. We need to get over our differences, figure those out, and provide a unified front to the world. And the best place to do that is with NATO and with Ukraine.
Can I actually just add one more provocative thing that I think would actually help us? And it's kind of counterintuitive to some of the other things I've said. But if going back to the NATO commitment in Afghanistan in particular, we owe our NATO allies an apology for how we left Afghanistan, for the failure to consult with them, for the failure to work with them on a follow-on counterterrorism force, leaving them the way we did. And then the consequences of that debacle in terms of signaling weakness and the failure to deter that has now led, I think, I see a very clear through line from that debacle in Afghanistan, which, again, that was a NATO force. That was a NATO operation. Yes, we were the predominant element of it, but it was a NATO. They came to our defense there, and we totally screwed them in the way that we handled that situation. And nobody in this administration, as far as I know, has apologized to a single one of our NATO allies about that. And I think we owe them a profound apology for that. And we've got work to do to repair that, especially, again, the countries that came to that were working with us in Afghanistan were a lot of our smaller NATO allies. And it wasn't, and so we really did not cover ourselves in glory there, and I think we do need to address that inconstancy that gives them a good reason to come back. Like if Kissinger had written something about that, if he wanted to have a word about that, then I would wholeheartedly agree. I think, those are the kinds of things that we do need to address where we have, and to add to what Chris said, where we do need to, put our own mask on first in some respects to get our story straight here, but also where we do, where we did fail our allies, we need to acknowledge that failure and be real about it with them.
Yeah, and it's not even just a question of credibility, right? ISIS-K is more of a threat to Europe than it is to us, and that's the other shoe waiting to drop.
Migration, ISIS-K, we really let them down with that, and Ukraine.
And just adding on to that, it's our adversaries who are taking advantage of our open system. Russia was the one that came up with the policy of weaponizing migration from Syria and sending Syrians into Europe, and they're working with, Venezuela to send Venezuelan migrants. So our adversaries recognize that the best way to defeat us is to defeat us from within, so that we're fighting ourselves and we destroy ourselves from within. So, we need to get our policies straight here and fix ourselves domestically.
All right, Chris, we're going to talk about the Middle East. There's a famous moment in October of 1973 where the United States has already begun. We're leaning into supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And the NSC, under Kissinger's direction, has developed this Rube Goldberg-esque plan to get supplies to Israel because there are concerns about how it looks, so I can't.
World War III.
Yeah,
heard that one before.
No one, exactly. No, only a specialist would be able to track all the details. We were to fly stuff to the Azores. We're going to put it on El Al planes. It was complicated, and as a result, it was going to be very slow. So Kissinger comes upstairs to the residence and briefs the president on the plan, and President Nixon is somewhat disgusted at what comes back to him. He set this thing in motion. He wants to hear the details now, and he orders Kissinger, to Kissinger's reported shock, and this stuck with Kissinger, and he wrote and spoke about it much through the rest of his life. You're going to get as much blame, this is more or less his exact words, you're going to get as much blame doing a thing halfway as doing it all the way. Just get the stuff there. And so the U.S. military gets involved, and we just flew the stuff there. And Richard Nixon, in that moment and through other decisions he made in those weeks, plays an enormous role in saving the state of Israel. Moreover, of course, as you know, he sets in motion a process by which ultimately the Soviet Union is really weakened in the region. America is strengthened. There's the Camp David Accords and a later administration. That all really begins arguably in that moment where Nixon gives that command to his Secretary of State. Well, that was then. This is now. Nixon, of course, is always motivated by this idea of peace, and I think that's something that's important to remember about him. The current administration would say, I think, that they are motivated by the same goal, that they want peace between Israel and its adversaries. They want peace in the region. They certainly don't want a regional war. And yet, here we are, 11 months into the latest really nasty round of things, and peace is not what we've got. What's going wrong? Why is this approach failing? What's happening here?
First of all, the Middle East is very complicated, and there's a lot going on between the various Arab countries and Iran and the Arab countries, and so it's very complicated. I would actually say that most of the Arab countries, this is where you see if the Abraham Accords are actually they can't openly agree to it, some of them, but they feel very comfortable and friendly towards Israel, of course. So that's an added layer. The real enemy of many of the Arab countries is Iran. And I think that's what you see playing out here, which is that Israel is, turning towards Iran now, and unfortunately, this is now becoming, like you said, a regional war that threatens to pull in other major powers when you consider the alliance between Iran and Russia. So, I think those are some of the big issues. But I think again, it's this idea that you sort of have to be in the middle. That we're all for peace. The Russians say they're for peace in Ukraine. Every dictator says they're for peace. Everyone says they're for peace. That doesn't mean they're going to actually put peace into place. So it's up to the United States to again lead. And if the United States leads in a way where we're strong and we show that we're going to have resolve and we're not going to back down and we're going to be aggressive in terms of how we reinforce our allies and friends, which in this case is Israel, then our adversaries will back down. So I think that, the United States has failed to show the appropriate leadership. I don't know why. I know there could be some domestic concerns, for this administration as they're coming into an election year, and they need to win swing states like Michigan and states like that. That could maybe be at play, but that's where you have to put domestic politics aside and you have to focus on what's right for America and their allies. And we absolutely have to show the world that we will defend our allies, because the one thing that Russia does to its benefit that is very good is they will do anything for their allies. And they proved that with Assad in Syria when they dropped chemical weapons, that they would go as far as they wanted. They would go to the end of the world to save their allies. And we need to be doing the same thing for ours. And in a way, when we do that, we will bring peace to the world, because then people know that they can't they can't mess with our allies because they're messing with the United States. So, I think that it was that failure to have a really strong response that has let this spiral out of control.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I was in Israel earlier this year, and it is remarkable how, to a person, you talk to people in Israel, and if they could go back to October 6th, they absolutely would. If they could go back to that day and to that pre-October 7th, status quo ante, they would do it in a heartbeat, absolutely in a heartbeat. But, the people who don't want to go back to October 6th are Hamas, Hezbollah, the Ayatollahs in Iran, and to a certain extent, Russia and China, because again, our adversaries are benefiting from this chaotic situation that is draining U.S. resources. It's making us, unpopular because we're defending, we're halfway doing it. We're not even doing it full-throated. I think we would, again, I love that quote, because it's like, look, we are going to get blamed. And I used to say this all the time when I was at the State Department in a whole host of contexts where our diplomats would want to, try to be too cute and too clever and use, magic words to try to pretend like we're not saying something. And I'm like, we're going to get blamed anyway. Why not, at least have the courage of our convictions and say what we believe and what we mean and what we're trying to do. And, Beijing thinks we're trying to undermine the regime and take them down. We can't convince them by telling them that we're not trying to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. So it's like a waste of time to try to convince them of that. I think the same is true with the Ayatollahs in Iran, and giving them $6 billion in cash is not going to convince them that we aren't innately hostile to them and that we will not, and I think that they are very committed to wiping Israel off the map. They're not trying to hide what they're doing. They're not pussyfooting around about it, to use a nice old-fashioned word. They're very serious, and they've got a plan, and they're operating against it. And we're like, we're kind of halfway doing this and halfway doing that, and getting all the downsides and none of the upsides, frankly, of being a good ally. And if you want people to be, standing with Israel right now is the best thing we can do to signal other countries that have questions about our reliability. If we can show that we're serious about standing with Israel during this really difficult time where it's not easy to be Israel's friend, then I think it really sends a strong message to all of our adversaries that we're serious, and to all of our friends and those that have questions about our seriousness. It's more important than ever.
So I want to stick with this theme of sort of being willing to go to the ends of the earth for one's allies, which is a phrase you use, Chris. Kelley, you're a human rights lawyer by trade. There's a complication here which we should address straight on, even if we're going to set it aside once we consider it, because there's definitely a Nixon legacy on this question that was a well-considered legacy, whether one agrees with it or not. Allies are often imperfect by many standards by which you might want to measure them. I want to sort of, in the theme that I want to sort of move us to the Pacific, we could pick any number of examples there. Historically, the Philippines at various points in its history has not lived up to our standards of human rights and democracy and so forth, and yet...
And neither have we. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, it would be hard to find anyone to disagree with you on that. But here's the question. How do we handle the shortcomings of our allies when at the same time they are critical to our strategic vision?
Well, again, I think the maxim of, being nicer to our friends and our enemies should definitely be, and our adversaries should definitely be followed as a general rule. But I think that for me, our closest and best allies, decade in and decade out, are those that are closest aligned with our values. Do we argue like people in a family? Yes. And do we have disagreements? Again, all my complaints about the Germans to the side. I would rather have them as an ally. We don't want to have to fight them again and beat them again. So I think that it is important to recognize that the core strength of our alliances is with countries that share our values, and that we should think about our alliances as these kind of concentric circles, and the ones that are closest to us on our values are the ones that we are most interoperable with, that we do the most with, that they get our most cutting edge technology, they get access to our most advanced intelligence and all of our capabilities. And our trade with them is the most frictionless, I think. This is how we need to think about those relationships. And then we circle out to the countries where they're struggling in some cases with democracy and human rights, more so than we are and our closest allies, and work with them where we can to help them. I think that very important lessons from our history with South Korea and Taiwan in terms of helping those and the Philippines and other countries where we have done very, at critical moments, important things to help those countries transition to democratic political systems, and our alliances with them have been the stronger for it. And I think people forget about those lessons day in and day out, and we're seeing this play out right now in Asia, in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, where and where we're in these contested countries in South and Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, where China is making a lot of inroads with countries, and these countries have challenging human rights and democracy records. Thailand is another one where we really struggle to navigate this. But I think that we don't do ourselves or these countries any favors when we pretend like they're not violating human rights, and when we pretend like they're not violating democratic norms, and we pretend like there are no consequences to that. I think that when it comes to some of our Gulf allies that are clearly so in the outer concentric circle, we have these countries that are authoritarian and are, not really even trying to move in the right direction. And there, I think we have to be honest that, we have transactional relations with some of these countries, and we recognize that they do not meet the democratic and human rights standards that we set for ourselves. But we've made a decision, and we need to be willing and able to explain that, but it needs to be the exception, in my opinion, and we need to understand that the further the delta is between what we say we believe in and how we act on the ground in terms of how we conduct ourselves in the world, the less credibility we have with our adversaries and allies alike. Thank you. Thank you.
And I think this has become such an important point. And I know we're covering a couple other alliances and we're getting to the end of the time. But when you're talking about the global South, in the United States goes to the global South and is lecturing the global South about Western values and things like this. We have to remember China and Russia are not doing that. And they're making inroads in the global South because of that. So I'm going to revert back to my grandfather, which is always good for me to do, to his 10 Commandments. Another one of his 10 Commandments for future presidents was that you need to differentiate between countries that offer some human rights and those that offer no human rights. So, don't sort of lump them all together. You have to look at it as shades of gray. And you have to be willing to work with some countries that maybe don't have a perfect human rights record. And as we see what China is doing in the global South, building up a coalition in the UN to dominate sort of the UN for whatever that's worth. But, China's able to do that because of how they're approaching the global South, ignoring the human rights records and focusing on economic gifts in return for political support. So as we fashion coalitions with the global South, which we have to do, Nigeria is going to be, not quite, but almost the largest country in the world by population at the end of this century. It could be upwards of 800 million people. It's maybe the second largest population in the world. It's going to become a much more significant player than it is today or even a decade ago. And we're going to have to figure out how do we incorporate those countries into our alliance system. And it starts with how do we look at human rights?
Well, and I think Nigeria is actually a great case study because it's been a democracy for exactly 25 years. They held their first genuine democratic elections in 1999. I happened to be there for those elections. I feel like the Forrest Gump of this conversation today. But it was really, extraordinary. I think that, yes, we do have to deal with the world as it is. And I like to, I'm not a child. I'm a real, I think I think you have to be a realist kind of day to day as you're going about your business, doing foreign policy and national security work. But if you don't have, aspirations that are more principled about where you're trying to go as you're going day by day and being a realist step by step, and those aspirations aren't rooted in some principled place, then what is there that differentiates us from our adversary? I think that China's in there cutting deals with corrupt and co-opting local elites, but they're also, again, looking at Sri Lanka as another example of where the people of Sri Lanka flatly rejected the Rajapaksa family in the recent elections and drove them out of power, in part because of them being totally co-opted by China. And the demand signal for democracy and for human rights and human freedom is strong as it's ever been. And we can't lose sight of that in the, as we're making short-term engagement with countries at the governmental level. We can't forget that there are people in these countries that may have different aspirations than the political elites that we are dealing with in the moment. And we have to be very careful about aligning ourselves with corrupt and extractive and abusive elites and how that reflects on our image with the people of those countries, because it may not be tomorrow, it may not be next week or next month or even next year, but eventually that demand, no human being wants to live their life as a slave. No human being wants to, be without freedom and human dignity. And so that's, if we are not standing for that on some level, even in the countries where we have to, hold our nose and deal with authoritarian dictatorships, then why would a country choose, or why would people choose to support us? It's I think it's this tension that runs throughout our foreign policy since the founding of this country, and we, sometimes we're more on one side, more on the other, but the fact that we wrestle with this is actually something that I'm enormously proud of when I go out and I talk to people in other countries, especially in the global south, and that we have the privilege of having a principled element to our foreign policy, and falling short of that from time to time is something that I'm enormously proud of, that we don't, I think, talk enough about as a source of pride and national strength.
So last question for you both, and we're going to be out of time in about 5 minutes, so I'll ask you to keep your responses brisk here. Chris, you made the point, or you made reference to the opening to China and the role that played then in the defeat of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and so forth. There's a lot of talk today about the Axis. I actually think it's a pretty good term because the term implies that Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they don't have a shared positive vision for the future. They want different things in the long run, but they have a shared vision of the short run, which is they want us out. And I think that's a fair statement. But here we are. We're at the Nixon Foundation. We're honoring the legacy of somebody who's famous for driving a wedge successfully between two countries, for which that had been the impression for many years. He detected that it was no longer the case. As we talk about these four countries as an axis, do we run the risk of missing opportunities here for maneuverability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you look at China and Russia, they certainly, are maybe allies of convenience at this point, or an alliance of convenience. But China still remembers, and my dad, when he met with Deng Xiaoping, he pointed to a map and circled Manchuria and said, Russia took that from us. So China has a long memory, and if they want to get back the 9-dash line, I think they certainly want to get back Siberia and its energy resources. So, it's an alliance of convenience at this point. And I think, we should recognize that at some point there'll be areas where we can sort of start to break down that alliance. And, you look at something like China, they have a lot of food that they need to buy. They can't grow it all. We have a lot of food to produce. That's someplace maybe that we can work together, and that's maybe something where we can have trade. I think that China and Russia have different aims with us. China sort of wishes that we would kind of go to sleep and, still buy their stuff. They need that for their economy. Their economy's on its back. They need us. Russia doesn't really have to interact with us. So there are differences there that I think that we have to be looking to exploit, and we shouldn't just cut off those avenues. If we can break up that alliance, because that's going to be the most important thing going forward. We can't just push China and Russia together. If China actually decided to put its full economic might behind Russia in Ukraine, that war would be over very quickly, and we can't let things like that happen.
Kelley, Currie, last word.
I think that, when it comes to these three countries, I am all in favor of doing, or I guess four with North Korea, but I am all in favor of doing everything we can to make their leaders pay a higher price for bad behavior than they currently do. And whether that cost is small and it's friction within them, or whether it's big, any incremental raising of the costs through imposing consequences, I think is just a win-win, to use a good Chinese phrase. I think that and then again, going back to what I was saying earlier, the Iranian people, there's no love for the Iranian government among the Iranian people. They are deeply unpopular. I think that, when you talk to, I know that right now it seems like Vladimir Putin is very strong and powerful in Russia, but when you talk to Russian dissidents and people who are committed to a different vision for Russia, a more European, less imperial Russia, they have a very strong sense that there is that eventually the Russian people will find a way to get rid of the kleptocratic state that Vladimir Putin has imposed on them and is using coercion, and they're feeling the costs of the war. None of these countries is 10 feet tall. They all have internal weaknesses and problems that they have to deal with. In many ways, China's foreign policy is an extension, in most ways, I would say, China's foreign policy is an extension of the Chinese Communist Party's insecurity about its illegitimacy as an and its paranoia about the weakness of its hold on power, and that they are engaged in the kind of foreign policy that they are engaged in because of that. And so I think that all of these countries have weaknesses that we can and should be exploiting in ways that would redound to our own benefit and to the benefit of the actual citizens as opposed to the governments of these countries.
Ambassador Kelley Currie, Christopher Nixon Cox, great conversation. Thank you both very much.